this episode, we close this set by looking at risk appetite and risk tolerance, two ideas that sit near the center of sound risk management, even though they often confuse beginners at first. This is the last episode in this set, and it ends in a fitting place because these concepts help tie together much of what has come before in Domain 1. By the time an organization understands its strategy, structure, culture, policies, processes, assets, and larger risk framework, it still has to answer one very practical question. How much uncertainty is it actually willing to live with while trying to achieve its goals? Risk appetite and risk tolerance help answer that question in a disciplined way, which is why they matter so much in certified in risk and information systems control, see risk. Without them, the organization may talk seriously about risk while still making emotional, inconsistent, or poorly explained decisions when real trade-offs appear. Once you understand them clearly, many governance and risk choices start to make more sense because you can finally see how leadership decides where to draw the line between acceptable exposure and exposure that needs stronger action. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our Course Companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good place to begin is with the larger purpose behind both terms. Organizations do not manage risk because they expect to eliminate every possible problem from the future. They manage risk because they want to pursue objectives intelligently without drifting into levels of uncertainty that could damage the business in ways leadership cannot justify or absorb. That means risk management is not only about finding threats or adding controls. It is also about deciding what amount of exposure is acceptable in pursuit of value. Some uncertainty will always remain because business activity itself creates uncertainty. New products, new markets, digital services, vendor reliance, complex operations, and legal obligations all come with some level of exposure. Risk appetite and risk tolerance exist to help leadership define boundaries around that exposure. They create a more stable basis for decision-making so that teams do not treat every risk like a crisis or every opportunity like a reason to ignore governance. For a beginner, this is one of the most useful mindset shifts in the whole certification. Good risk management is not just about alarm. It is about setting boundaries that make judgment more consistent. Risk appetite is the broader of the two ideas, and it usually reflects the general amount and type of risk an organization is willing to pursue or accept while working toward its objectives. It is often tied closely to strategy, leadership style, industry conditions, financial capacity, regulatory expectations, and the overall identity of the organization. A startup trying to grow quickly may accept more uncertainty in certain areas than a hospital, a bank, or a public utility because the business model, the consequences of failure, and the expectations of stakeholders are very different. Risk appetite therefore operates at a higher level. It helps leadership express the general posture of the business. Is the organization willing to move aggressively in search of growth, or is it more cautious because stability and trust matter more than speed? A beginner should think of appetite as the organization's broad comfort zone for risk-taking and risk-bearing. It does not usually answer every detailed operational question by itself, but it does provide a directional view that helps later decisions stay aligned with how the enterprise wants to operate. Risk tolerance is narrower and more specific. If appetite describes the overall level of risk the organization is willing to accept, tolerance helps define the acceptable variation or limit around a particular objective, process, metric, or condition. In simpler terms, appetite says something about the organization's broad posture, while tolerance helps answer how far a specific condition can move before the organization decides it has gone beyond what leadership considers acceptable. This is why tolerance often becomes more useful in daily management. Leaders may have a general appetite for innovation or growth, but they still need practical limits around service downtime, control exceptions, error rates, compliance deviations, data exposure, financial loss, or other measurable conditions. Tolerance makes those limits more visible. It tells teams when they are still operating inside an approved boundary and when they need escalation, new treatment, or stronger oversight. That is what makes the concept so practical in C risk. It converts broad leadership intent into decision boundaries people can actually use when business pressure and operational reality begin to collide. The relationship between appetite and tolerance becomes much easier once you stop trying to treat them as competing definitions. They are connected parts of one larger decision structure. Appetite provides the broad context for the organization's willingness to carry uncertainty, while tolerance applies that thinking more specifically to areas that need clearer operational boundaries. A healthy organization usually needs both. If it has appetite without tolerance, the guidance may sound thoughtful but remain too general to help teams know when conditions require action. If it has tolerance without appetite, the organization may set narrow limits in isolated places without a coherent sense of the larger business posture behind those limits. C-Risk wants you to understand the relationship because the exam often rewards answers that reflect both broad business direction and specific decision discipline. For a beginner, a useful analogy is that appetite is like the overall route the organization is willing to travel, while tolerance is the set of lane boundaries and warning markers that help people know when they are drifting into more dangerous territory. Both matter, and each becomes more useful when understood in relation to the other. These ideas only make sense when connected to business strategy, goals, and objectives. Risk appetite is not supposed to float above the organization like a generic statement that sounds wise but has no real link to what the business is trying to do. It should reflect real business conditions. A company focused on rapid innovation may accept more uncertainty in development speed while still maintaining low tolerance for privacy failures or major service outages. A healthcare organization may have low appetite for anything that threatens patient safety or regulatory integrity, even if it is willing to accept some uncertainty in less critical support functions. This is why appetite and tolerance cannot be chosen in a vacuum. They need to reflect what the organization values, how it operates, what obligations it carries, and what consequences it can or cannot absorb. Once you connect them to business objectives, the concepts become much easier to apply. They stop sounding like abstract boardroom language and start functioning as practical decision tools tied to what success means for that particular organization. Governance plays a major role here because appetite and tolerance are leadership responsibilities, even though many functions may help shape them. Senior leaders and the board usually have an important role in defining the organization's overall posture because these decisions affect strategy, resource allocation, public trust, and the level of uncertainty the business is willing to carry. Supporting functions such as enterprise risk, security leadership, finance, compliance, operations, and legal may help translate business conditions into workable guidance, but leadership must still own the final direction. That ownership matters because appetite and tolerance shape significant choices. They influence when new initiatives proceed, when risks are escalated, when exceptions are accepted, and when additional controls are justified despite cost or inconvenience. If leadership does not clearly own these boundaries, teams may improvise them in inconsistent ways. Some managers may become overly cautious, while others take risks leadership never intended to accept. C-Risk teaches that clear governance around appetite and tolerance reduces that inconsistency by giving the organization a more stable basis for deciding when business risk remains acceptable and when it crosses into territory that needs formal attention. Application becomes much clearer when we move from definition into everyday examples. Imagine an online retailer whose strategy depends on growth, convenience, and customer loyalty. Leadership may show moderate or even strong appetite for certain kinds of innovation risk because the business needs to move quickly, test new features, and respond to market changes. At the same time, the organization may have very low tolerance for failures in payment integrity, major exposure of customer data, or long periods of unavailable service during peak sales periods. Now imagine a utility provider. That organization may have lower overall appetite for disruption because continuity and public trust are central to its mission, and its tolerances around outages, safety issues, and regulatory failures may be much tighter. These examples show why appetite and tolerance are not universal formulas. They are organizational expressions of what kinds of uncertainty the business can live with and what kinds it considers too damaging to permit. The more clearly they match the business context, the more useful they become in helping teams interpret risk and make aligned decisions under pressure. These concepts are especially important in prioritization because organizations constantly face more issues than they can solve at once. Risk appetite and tolerance help leadership decide which issues demand immediate action, which can be monitored, which may be accepted temporarily, and which should trigger escalation because the current condition no longer fits approved boundaries. Without these concepts, prioritization often becomes reactive. Teams push the problems they feel most strongly about. Leaders respond to the loudest voices, and risk conversations become shaped by urgency rather than by structured business judgment. Appetite and tolerance bring discipline to that process. They help frame the conversation around whether a condition fits what the organization said it was willing to accept. That makes prioritization more defensible because it connects action to predefined expectations rather than to sudden pressure alone. For a beginner, this is one of the clearest reasons these ideas matter so much. They give the business a stable reference point for deciding what really requires attention first and what can remain within controlled limits for a time. They also play a major role in controlled decisions and exception handling. Many organizations establish policies and standards that define the normal baseline for control, but there will still be times when a team cannot meet a requirement immediately or wants to operate differently because of cost, speed, legacy systems, or business need. Risk appetite and tolerance help leadership judge those exceptions more intelligently. If the exception creates exposure that stays within approved tolerance and is temporary, visible, and understood, leadership may approve it with monitoring and a clear timeline. If the exception pushes the business beyond what it said was acceptable, then stronger action or escalation may be required. This is what makes the concept so practical. They help answer the question of when a workaround is still manageable and when it becomes too risky for the organization's stated posture. C-Risk values this kind of disciplined thinking because mature risk management is not about banning every exception. It is about deciding whether the exception remains inside or outside the boundaries the organization deliberately set for itself. A common misconception is that higher risk appetite always means recklessness and lower risk appetite always means maturity. Neither idea is correct. An organization with a higher appetite in some areas may simply be pursuing a strategy that requires more experimentation, more rapid change, or more competitive movement than another organization. That can be entirely reasonable if leadership understands the exposure, has the resources to absorb setbacks, and keeps low tolerance where consequences would be unacceptable. On the other hand, an organization with very low stated appetite can still behave badly if its teams ignore controls, hide issues, or operate beyond tolerance without honest reporting. Another misconception is that appetite and tolerance should be reduced to slogans. Statements such as "we are risk-averse" or "we value innovation" can sound meaningful, but unless they influence real decisions, they do very little to support governance. C-Risk wants you to move beyond those shallow interpretations. The real value of appetite and tolerance appears when they help the business decide, consistently and visibly, how much uncertainty it will accept in specific conditions and why. Measurement and communication are also essential if these ideas are going to influence the organization in practice. A broad appetite statement that never reaches managers in usable form will not shape daily decisions. Likewise, a set of tolerance limits that nobody monitors or understands will fail to provide the disciplined leadership intended. This is why organizations need to translate appetite and tolerance into forms people can apply. That may involve thresholds, escalation criteria, reporting expectations, issue categories, or management review practices that show whether the business is operating inside the boundaries leadership approved. Communication matters because different audiences need different levels of detail. Senior leaders may focus on whether exposures remain consistent with the broader posture of the enterprise, while managers and process owners need clearer signals about what conditions require action in their part of the business. A mature approach does not keep appetite and tolerance hidden in governance documents. It turns them into living parts of reporting, decision-making, and management conversation so that business units know how leadership expects uncertainty to be handled. These concepts are not fixed forever, and that is another important point for beginners. Risk appetite and risk tolerance can and often should change as the organization changes. A company entering a new market, facing financial pressure, recovering from a major incident, dealing with stronger regulation, or changing leadership direction may revisit what level of exposure it is willing to carry. A business that once accepted considerable uncertainty during a growth phase may decide later that it needs tighter tolerances because customer expectations, legal exposure, or operational scale have changed. This is why governance around appetite and tolerance needs periodic review rather than one-time approval followed by years of neglect. The business environment is dynamic, and the boundaries for acceptable risk may need to move with it. C-Risk teaches this because good risk management is not static. It depends on reassessing whether current boundaries still fit current strategy, current obligations, and current capacity to absorb failure. When leadership recognizes that, appetite and tolerance remain useful tools instead of becoming outdated statements that no longer reflect how the organization truly operates. Culture also affects whether appetite and tolerance work as intended. An organization may define them carefully and still fail if managers treat them as formal language that can be ignored when deadlines tighten or revenue goals dominate the conversation. If employees believe leadership only rewards speed and results, then formal tolerance limits may be bypassed quietly in the name of convenience or competitiveness. On the other hand, a healthy culture supports honest reporting when a condition approaches or exceeds tolerance, and it encourages leaders to treat those signals as useful information rather than embarrassing setbacks. This is one reason the topic fits so naturally with the rest of Domain 1. Appetite and tolerance do not stand alone. They depend on strategy, governance, structure, communication, and culture to become real. When those supporting elements are healthy, the organization can use appetite and tolerance to guide decisions with much more consistency. When they are weak, the language may still exist, but the business may drift well beyond its stated boundaries without noticing until the consequences become harder to manage. By the time you step back from this final topic in the set, the central lesson should feel clear. Risk appetite and risk tolerance help an organization define how much uncertainty it is broadly willing to accept and how far specific conditions can move before stronger action is required. Appetite gives the wider posture, while tolerance creates the more practical limits that help teams manage, escalate, and prioritize real conditions. Together, they support better governance because they connect strategy to decision boundaries, reduce inconsistency, and help the business explain why some exposures are acceptable while others are not. That is why they matter so much in C-Risk. They turn risk management from vague concern into structured judgment. As the last episode in this set, this topic closes the loop on many ideas you have already seen because it shows how governance, strategy, roles, culture, assets, and frameworks all come together when leadership must decide how much uncertainty the organization is truly prepared to live with in pursuit of its goals.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.